Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of the cedhcast. My name is Ian and with me as always is my co-host Braden.
Hey guys!
To start things off on episode 3, we are going to review Theros Beyond Death. But before we get to that, we have a patron shout out. So who are we shouting out this week, Braden?
Today we are shouting out Jason Welsh. Thank you, Jason, for being a competitor tier for the last 2 months. It's very much appreciated.
All right, now on to the main topic. Today we are going to be talking about Theros Beyond Death. This is the brand new set for Magic the Gathering, and we're going to talk about a bunch of cards that we find interesting for the competitive format. Now, to be clear here, we are going to specifically talk about cards that we think will be competitive viable, or at least maybe will elicit a deck in the future. We will not be talking about cards that are playable in just casual EDH. This is strictly for the competitive format.
Yeah, most of these cards are either going to an already existing deck, or they're kind of like a niche piece into one or two decks that you sometimes see around the table, like Narumea or Godo.
So the first card we wanted to talk about today is Heliod, Sun Crowned. This is a new god from Theros Beyond Death. Braden, do you want to break down the card for us?
Sure. Heliod the Sun Crowned is a legendary enchantment creature with the creature type God. It has indestructible, and as long as your devotion to white is less than 5, Heliod is not a creature. Whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control, and for 1 and a white, you may give another target creature a lifelink until the end of turn. It's also a 5/5. This card has a few interesting synergies with cards like Walking Ballista, which allows you to remove a counter to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Once Walking Ballista has lifelink, it can basically do infinite damage to any number of creatures or players. So a few people have been looking into making this a commander or going into some type of mono white deck that already exists, like Teshar. Heliod is a legendary enchantment creature, so it will trigger Teshar's ability, which returns a creature from the graveyard with CMC 3 or less.
As Braden mentioned, the card can combo with both Triskelion and Walking Ballista, and the reason that the deck is being considered as a competitive commander, even though the fact that it's a mono white, is because white actually has a lot of really good ways to tutor up cards like Walking Ballista and Triskelion. You have cards like Enlightened Tutor, there's the land, Inventor's Fair, you have Recruiter of the Guard, which is a creature that will allow you to look for cards with toughness 2 or less, which, of course, Walking Ballista in your library is actually a 0/0. There's actually a number of relevant tutors in the card pool that we have right now that will allow Heliod to really combo off very easily.
Additionally, the card quality in some already existing decks is very high because they're already running cards like Walking Ballista. Maybe you're an Eggs deck and you want to be casting 0 mana artifacts to get some type of trigger. Well, Walking Ballista, you're probably already playing the card in that kind of deck, and Heliod might slide right in. That's why there's some excitement about the card. Additionally, there are cards that allow you to search for creatures with converted mana cost 1 or less, and Walking Ballista has 2 X's in its cost, so the converted mana cost is 0, so you would be able to tutor for the creature with those cards.
Yeah, I believe that's Ranger of Eos and Ranger Captain of Eos. So, Heliod really looks to be either A, a viable commander, or B, a really interesting slot in some of the more fringe decks that exist already. Originally, it was talked about in Hulk Piles, but that was before the printing of Thassa's Oracle, which we obviously talked about in great detail last week. So the next card that we have on our list here is Thirst for Meaning.
Thirst for Meaning is a 3-mana instant for 2 and a blue. It says, draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard an enchantment card. This is a bit of a callback to a few cards. One of them is Thirst for Knowledge. Thirst for Knowledge allows you to do the exact same thing, but instead you discard a artifact instead of an enchantment. There's also Compulsive Research, which allows you to discard a land instead of 2 cards. These cards used to be way better. The format has evolved to a point where you don't really want to pay 3 mana to draw 3 cards, even though that sounds a little ridiculous. Even at instant speed, too. I don't think this will see much play. If there ever is an Enchantress deck, which a few people are working on, as these sets kind of evolve and the format gets more and more Enchantresses just very slowly, maybe if that Enchantress deck ever comes to fruition, this will be a card in the deck. But otherwise, I don't expect this to see much play.
Yeah, I think it's pretty important because there actually are a number of archetypes right now on the database that actually do run Thirst for Knowledge. A lot of them tend to be sort of the mono blue Baral style control decks, or I know in the list I run for Grand Arbiter, Thirst for Knowledge is on there. And I've actually been working on the deck and pushing it more towards an enchantment theme, especially with all these new cards from Theros. So a card like Thirst for Meaning might actually become more relevant to the deck because there's a lot of really powerful enchantments like Counterbalance, Land Tax, things like that.
This is a very powerful card, don't get me wrong. I just think the format is more powerful than it right now.
The next card we are going to talk about is Cedhcast Champion, which is a brand new Enchantress card.
So, this is a green creature human warrior for 2 and a green. It has Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Citizen Champion and draw a card. And it has a 1/3 body. I think this is exactly what I was talking about when I said there's like an Enchantress deck kind of growing in the background of the format. There's a few people working on it. We're just going to need like 2 or 3 more of these, I think, before the deck is actually real. Currently, we have our Gothi Enchantress, which has a similar effect. You draw a card whenever you play an enchantment for 1 and a green. Also has Shroud. There is also Eidolon of Blossoms, which is a 4-mana Enchantress, but you draw a card when it enters the battlefield as well because it's enchantment. I think we need more of these, but it's always good to see. And this card actually gets really big really quickly. If you play 1 enchantment, it's a 2/4, which is like one of the best bodies that you could possibly have in this format. So I think it'll eventually get there, but it's going to be a few years.
Yeah, I think especially the part about the body. For those who don't know, the CEDH meta is very heavily focused towards obviously the Tymna meta, and having a body that can both survive combat with a card like Tymna or Thrasios or cards like that are going to be getting in there to get Tymna triggers, and also it can survive the cards that are being played to counteract that meta, i.e. things like Pyroclasm or sometimes a smaller Toxic Deluge. You know, people aren't going to really be paying like 7 life into a Toxic Deluge just to get a Cetessan champion, or they will, and you'll have forced them into that position.
Also, if they have to pay 7 life to kill your Citizen champion, you're probably putting quite a bit of pressure on their life total already because you have a 5/7. It seems pretty
Right.
good. Additionally, you may notice that some of the enchantresses I mentioned have very low toughness, and so the deck obviously folds to quite a bit of creature removal like Pyroclasm. So having a creature like this that also builds upon the weaknesses of the already existing theoretical deck is very interesting.
Yeah, I'm definitely really excited to see where people go with this list. Speaking of a card that probably goes in that list, let's talk about Dryad of the Elysian Grove.
Dryad of the Elysian Grove, it's a very good name, is a enchantment creature nymph. For 2 and a green, it has that sweet 2/4 body, and you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. Some clarification. Just because you have every basic land type does not mean you are a basic land. If a City of Brass has every basic land type, it can tap for blue, or red, or white, or green, or black, or tap for every color. It'll have 6 abilities, basically. That's like a way to think about it.
Yeah, but it's still a non-basic land.
And if your Ancient Tomb has all basic land types, it will also tap for every color, in addition to being able to tap for 2 mana and deal 2 damage to you. So that's kind of how it works functionally. I think this card is very interesting. One way it was explained that I really like is that if Corsair Kruvix is half of an Oracle of Moldiah, this is the other half of an Oracle of Moldiah. I think the Corsair Kruvix side is better because it helps you make additional land drops in the form of just not having to play the lands from your hand, and if you missed a land drop for turn and the top card of your deck is the land, you just play it. I think this is also sort of useful because if you have the card advantage engines in play, being able to play your additional land each turn is very useful, and many decks will probably have the card advantage engines they need. However, I do think playing an additional land each turn is not a very powerful effect unless you're playing cards like Life from the Loam or Sylvan Library, and you can only run so many of those before your deck doesn't do anything.
So I find that very interesting because I think this is the more interesting half of the Oracle of Moldiah, because specifically this is an enchantment creature, and Corsair Kruvix, although it is sort of a land fixer, it is card advantage engine in the fact that it allows you to clear lands off the top of your library, but this card allows you to ramp. And I think, especially, as I mentioned, transitioning into this card, it is an enchantment creature, meaning that not only is it just a regular creature that has a body, but it also will trigger those enchantress effects that we were just talking about. So I think there's a deck there, because when you get an enchantress engine going, the card advantage is pretty ridiculous. Like if you have 2 of those every time you're playing a very powerful card in your deck, you're drawing 2 cards. I think if and when that type of shell does come about, I think this card could be very powerful in it.
I just think in the general meta, people are looking at this card and thinking it's exploration, and I don't think many decks are actually playing that card. If you're on Life from the Loam, you're probably on Exploration, but most decks don't want to be on Life from the Loam, and for this card to be good, you need card advantage, and usually I'd just rather have the card advantage half of Oracle Moldiah than the making extra land drops. Making extra land drops is only useful if you are able to play 2 lands a turn, which usually means you're required to draw like 3 or 4 cards a turn, probably more than that realistically. And if you're doing that, you're probably already winning the game just by having drawn 3 or 4 cards a turn the entire game. Where Corso Kruvix, you either get ahead in terms of card advantage by playing the top card of your library, or you get some type of reward like the gaining a life, or making your fetch lands basically free in terms of life payment. So I think that's Corso Kruvix is the more powerful card than this card, but in the hypothetical Enchantress deck that may exist one day, this card is probably better than Corso Kruvix.
Yeah, and I think you bring up an interesting point about the decks that play Exploration, because the ones that I know right now that are playing Exploration are really only playing it because it is only a single mana. For them, it's often play an Exploration and get your second land, maybe your third or fourth land out by turn 1 and 2, as opposed to this, which already costs 3 mana, so by that point it's no longer relevant to be able to accelerate those first couple land drops out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The next card we are going to be talking about is Thassa's Oracle, and by that we just mean we're going to remind you that it's in Theros Beyond Death, and we have an entire half an hour section talking about it in last week's episode. So if you want to hear us rant about how horrible this card's going to be for our format, feel free to rewind one back, or if you've heard it already, we're not talking about it again. Great.
Shaper Savant had excellent insight into the power of this card. We do not need to mimic him. We can just ask you to go listen to him talk about it.
After that, we're going to talk about a pretty spicy card that I think's a Braden special. Let's talk about Nyx Bloom Ancient.
Oh boy. Nyx Bloom Ancient is a enchantment creature elemental for 4 GGG. We're talking 7 mana, 4 and 3 green. It has trample for some reason. I can't imagine you're ever attacking with this card. It also says if you tap a permanent for mana, now a permanent, that includes Soul Ring, includes Elves of Deep Shadow, includes your lands,
Grim Monolith,
anything. But if you tap a permanent for mana, it produces 3 times as much of that mana instead. And it has a 5/5 body for some reason. This card is so sick, but it has some very interesting interactions with some cards that really shouldn't be legal in this format. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Flash. Flash is an instant for 1 and a blue that lets you put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield. You may then pay its cost reduced by 2. So in this example, you put Nyx Bloom Ancient into play. You then have to pay green, 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 and 2 generic, so 5 mana instead of 7. But you put Nyx Bloom Ancient into play first. So all of your permanents tap for 3 times as much mana now, even though you haven't paid the cost of the creature yet. So you tap a forest for 3 green, and you tap an island for 2 blue, you float a blue, now you have a Nyx Bloom Ancient. Or you can do the spicy thing, which is where you tap all your permanents, you float some ridiculous amount of mana, which you're allowed to do because Flash asks you to make a payment. So you float all this mana, and then you tell Flash, I would not like to make a payment. I'd like to sacrifice my Nyx Bloom Ancient. So you've tapped all your mana for 3 times as much as it would typically make. Now, at 2 mana, at instant speed, you either put in a Nyx Bloom Ancient for what is effectively 4 mana. If you did it for 4 mana, it's 1 from the Flash, a blue from the Flash, 1 of your lands that taps for the 2 generic mana you need, and 1 of your lands that taps for the 3 green you need. So 4 mana total. You've paid 4 mana for your Nyx Bloom Ancient. Or you've made some ridiculous amount of mana, and you don't get a Nyx Bloom Ancient. Either way, this is sweet. The second option is you flash in an Academy Rector. So you put Academy Rector, which is a creature with text that says when it dies, you search your library for an enchantment and you put it on the battlefield. So you flash in your Academy Rector, sack it, you go get Nyx Bloom Ancient, put it into play. You've now paid 2 mana at instant speed for a Nyx Bloom Ancient. So you can put this card in off of flash for somewhere between 2 and 4 mana, which is ridiculous. I have been brewing a deck called Big Green, which is a joke, I guess, of a deck, which is based off of my medium green deck. Basically, it'll be playing the Fishhole combo plus Nyx Bloom Ancient because Nyx Bloom Ancient's hilarious, and we'll be on Rector too. It's a joke. We'll probably do an episode about it at some point. But I'm very excited about this card. I can't wait to tap my Gaia's Cradle for 40-something mana. I can't wait to cast a Phantasmal Image, make a copy of Nyx Bloom Ancient, make all my Soul Ring taps for 18 mana. Seems pretty good. You only need 280 mana to draw your deck off of Thrasios most of the time. And while you're doing that, you'll probably draw rocks that are mana positive. So like if you play your Chromox, it now taps for 3 mana. And if you have 2 Nyx Bloom Ancients, each land taps for 6 mana. Soul Ring taps for 18 mana. Gaia's Cradle taps for a ridiculous amount of mana. I'm very excited about this card.
Now, I have to ask, not to put a bummer on this exciting note of tripling your mana, why, if you're playing Flash Rector, why not just play Omniscience?
Because, and this has happened to me many times, back in the old days where the format was less developed and I was a worse Magic player, I played a lot of decks that played Flash Rector. And the problem with Flash Rector is that eventually you run out of cards. And a lot of the cards that are good at drawing cards, there's either very few of them or they have X in their costs. So you actually need to pay mana at some point.
Okay.
If you put an Exclamation into play and you activate Thrasios 3 or 4 times, and you make like 3 or 4 land drops off of that, then you untap, all your lands that you just played are basically mana equivalent now. They each tap for 3 mana. If you do this, you're just going to get so ahead on mana, and mana is actually more useful than casting spells for free. Because if you have an Omniscience in play, most of the time what you'll do is you'll dump your hand, you'll have 0 cards in hand, except maybe your counter spells, and you can't do anything, because you can't dump hundreds of mana into a Thrasios, which will get you card advantage and also get you lands that tap for mana more. It doesn't create advantage. Omniscience isn't actually that good. If your commander doesn't let you convert mana into card advantage, Omniscience might be better, because it's harder to kill.
So the next card we're going to talk about is an interesting utility piece, and it seems like a small effect, but it actually has a pretty good impact on the game. The card is going to be Soul Guide Lantern.
Soul Guide Lantern is a 1-mana artifact that when it enters the battlefield, you exile a target card from a graveyard. You can then tap it and sacrifice it to exile each of your opponent's graveyards. You can also pay 1, tap it, and sack it to draw a card.
Yeah, so when I was looking at this card, I was taking a look at it because I was talking to a friend of mine at our local CEDH night, and we were looking at the card because this is the first artifact graveyard exile effect that exiles each opponent's graveyard. First of all, for 1 mana, you come in and you get to snipe a card right out of the graveyard. So if you're playing in a meta with a lot of either A, Reanimator effects, World Gorger combo, or even if you're playing a lot of Opus Thief, which my meta does have a good amount of, this is really good at getting away key cards out of there. So say someone has just passed after dumping a World Gorger in, and they don't have a Kozilek in their hand to try and shuffle everything back. That's, for 1 mana, you can just snag that right out of there. Obviously, Graveyard Hate's really good. But until this point, we had cards like Relic of Progenitus, which exile everybody's graveyard. We had Tormod Script, which only exiles 1 target person's graveyard. And some other even worse effects that still only hit either everybody or a single person. This is the first artifact graveyard hate piece that hits each opponent's graveyard. So you're playing a list yourself that relies on these graveyards. You can actually now slot this card in, and it is quite effective. Also, worst case scenario, you pay 1, sack it, draw a card if you're not playing in an active meta that is trying to use those graveyards. Which is important because a lot of metas have a problem where there are certain decks that require answers and specific cards. Sometimes there are games, say you're playing a deck with Rest in Peace. Rest in Peace can shut down certain decks just by being played, and if it's protected, will make it so a player is literally out of a game. In a game where Rest in Peace isn't relevant, it's just sitting there in your hand doing nearly nothing, or sitting on the field doing nearly nothing. The fact that Soul Guide Lantern can also cantrip itself, meaning it draws a card and replaces itself, and allows you to draw more gas, is actually pretty helpful.
One thing I did just realize is that if you run into a lot of Null Rod effects, this does at least do something into a Null Rod. It exiles 1 thing, which is kind of interesting. I don't play a lot online, and so I'm able to predict what I'm going to run into more often than most people. And I also don't run a lot of graveyard decks, so I'm kind of in an awkward situation where Rest in Peace is just always better for me. But I can see how this would be useful maybe in like a Kest deck, or in a deck that can't run Rest in Peace.
So the next card we want to talk about is Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath.
Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, is a 3-mana legendary creature, Elder Giant, for 1, a green, and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless it escaped. It has escape for green, green, blue, blue. You exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. So basically, if it's in your graveyard, you can cast it by exiling 5 other cards and playing green, green, blue, blue. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life and draw a card. Then, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. And it's a 6/6. So, this is a very interesting commander for a few reasons. 1, because it sacrifices itself when it's cast from the command zone. If you can cast it infinitely, you can draw your deck. Also, because it's a commander with an enter the battlefield effect in green, it's also a food chain commander. That is kind of interesting. So, there's a few things you can do with this guy. I recently worked with the 99 during a live stream, and we brewed an entire deck around this guy that I can list on our Twitter or on our YouTube channel. But The focus of the deck we went with was we had Food Chain. So if you have a creature that says you may cast it from exile, Food Chain makes infinite creature mana. Mist Hollow Griffin is a good example of that. So if you cast Mist Hollow Griffin for 4, you can exile it for 5 mana, then you can cast it from exile for 4 mana, and now you can make infinite mana of every color. So if you cast your commander infinitely with the infinite mana, you'll draw your whole deck and gain a lot of life and be able to put all your lands into play. Additionally, we're running Vigian Graft Mage combos, which is a creature that untaps creatures with +1/+1 counters on them. So we're running a few creatures that make lots of blue or lots of green mana, and then using Vigian Graft Mage to untap them. The most popular one of these is Incubation Druid, which taps for 3 mana of any color your lands could tap for, as long as it has a +1/+1 counter on it. Vigian Graft Mage actually puts the counter on it too, which is very interesting. So together with Food Chain and the Vigian Graft Mage combos, we made an interesting list that could make infinite mana pretty consistently in blue-green, which is good for budgetary reasons. It's good because you get to run back to basics. It's also kind of an interesting brew if you're into infinite mana strategies. Additionally, Euro is just a very good grind piece. If you just keep playing him, you just kind of keep getting ahead on cards, and being a 6/6 is like not a bad thing. So I think this guy has some future in the Elsha tier, where he's like pretty good, but not like a defining deck of the format. Kind of like a defining deck of the budget place of the format. Maybe like a Yisan. A little worse than Yisan, but somewhere around there.
I think the fact that Uro comes back from the graveyard for only 4 mana is actually pretty amazing, especially because creature decks are so relevant in our current meta with the Thrasios Tymna or Crom Tymna meta going on right now. So having a 6/6 body that gives you extra effects every single time it attacks is pretty amazing. And that's 4 mana. Like, the fact that it ramps you and draws you cards every single turn is great.
Yeah, it's kind of like a really bad Tymna, which is like still an above average commander.
So there's actually a theme in Theros Beyond Death that actually doesn't have a mechanic to it, but it's a bunch of cards that say whenever you cast the first spell on each of your opponent's turns, they have a special effect. There's a bunch of different cards in this style that I'd love to talk about. The first is Waveback Hippocamp, which is a 3-drop that says whenever you cast your first spell on each of your opponent's turns, you get to draw a card, which is a very powerful ability, and I think if it unfortunately wasn't a 2/2, that would be a card that's slotted right into Curiosity Control, but I don't think it's going to be there. The next is Naiad of the Hidden Coves, which is a 2/3 for 3 mana for 2 and a blue, and that says spells on your opponent's turns actually cost 1 less.
I think this card's a bit more relevant than most of the other cards with these effects, because there is a deck called Narumea, which tries to cast Ghostly Flicker and the commander Narumea, usually during your opponent's turns. The combo usually costs 7 mana. With this in play, it only costs 5 mana, which is a pretty big difference. Also, the 2/3 body is pretty relevant, and it helps with quite a few of the counterspells that deck's already trying to run. I mean, it runs some of the 3 mana counterspells. It runs Mindbreak Trap, which is just a chunky boy. So I think it's good that there's a card like this that'll slide into that deck and make the combo a little bit more efficient, make some of the counterspells more efficient. Block Tymna, because that deck actually loses the Tymna sometimes because it doesn't have a lot of blockers.
Yeah, I agree. I think that and Baral, the Drago control deck, also could really use this a lot. Actually, in Rush Me too. I think a lot of commanders that have kind of found their way out of the format, but a lot of people still will play them, sort of diehard fans of decks like Baral, Rashmi, and even Niv Mizzet, Perun. These all are decks that really rely on playing a lot of spells on your opponent's turns. They are hard control decks in our format, and having a card that reduces the mana cost of cards on turns that aren't theirs is pretty powerful. Narumea also fits in that bill. Now, there are a few more cards that also trigger on your opponent's turns. The next one is Stinging Lionfish. Stinging Lionfish is a 2/1 for 2, and it says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turns, you may tap or untap target non-land permanent. Now, Braden, you put this one on there. What particularly piqued you about that one?
So just like the card I just mentioned, Naiad of the Hidden Coves, this card is also very useful in the Drago hard control decks. It's also very powerful in the Narumea decks that are trying to either counter most of the spells your opponents are casting, or is trying to go off at instant speed during your opponent's turn. Again, as I mentioned, the combo costs 7 mana, so if this untaps a mana vault, it pays for quite a lot of the combo, which is very powerful. Also, this does untap Mana Vault and Grim Monolith, which are both cards that usually don't want to pump mana into to untap, so being able to untap them for effectively free by just casting a counterspell is pretty good. This does block Tymna. It kills Tymna, and it's not good enough that your opponents think you won't throw it in front of Tymna. So it's pretty good there. It doesn't block Thrasios, though.
Yeah, one thing that's definitely a little spicier with this card is a lot of people have talked about lines where you end up actually casting your Isochron Scepter a little bit early, and if you play a card such as Counterspell under your Isochron Scepter and have Stinging Lionfish out, suddenly you have a Counterspell on everybody's turn just for 2 cards, and that's pretty impressive. Now, it's definitely more of a fringe play with the card, but people have been talking about it, and it is, as I said, pretty spicy. So
This card is pretty spicy. It is surprisingly powerful.
yeah, I would not be surprised to find ourselves a couple years down the line and have someone rediscover this card and be like, oops, we broke it.
It'll be pretty hard because it says the first spell of your opponent's turn, but this is pretty cute with like a silence on an Isochron Scepter.
Ooh.
Or some effect that says your opponents can't draw cards this turn. I know there's like an Ocean Thief instant, I'm pretty sure. So something like that.
The last cards I wanted to talk about under this category of triggering on the first spell your opponent casts each turn are both Dreamstalker Manticore and, more importantly, Mischievous Chimera. So for those of you that don't know, there is a very popular control deck in our format called Curious Control because it plays around curiosity effects. Curiosity is an aura that targets a creature for 1 blue, and it says whenever that creature deals damage to an opponent, you get to draw a card. What's important about that card is that it does not say combat damage, meaning any sort of triggered ability allows you to draw a card. So Curious Control is a deck that uses curiosity effects on its commander, Vile Smasher the Fierce, but occasionally it plays it on other cards in the deck that replicate that effect. So both Dreamstalker Manticore and Mischievous Chimera deal damage to an opponent if you cast a spell on your opponent's turn, your first spell on their turn. Mischievous Chimera is especially potent because it deals a damage to each opponent and you get to scry 1, meaning that if you put a curiosity effect on Mischievous Chimera, the first spell you cast on each of your opponent's turn is going to allow you to scry 1 and draw 3, which is huge. And it's a 2/2 flyer, which doesn't hurt at all. So since we're going to a set with the Underworld, we have to talk about the Cerberus. The card we're talking about is Kunoros, Hound of Athreos.
The Hound of Athreos. Kunoros. Whatever. The Hound of Athreos is a 3-mana 3/3 for 1, a white, and a black. It's a legendary Hound. We now have the Hound Commander. Get your black-white dog tribal decks ready, guys. It has Vigilance, Menace, and Lifelink, which is insane. Creature cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield. Oh, this is looking to be a very powerful card. Players can't cast spells from graveyards. Is this Grafdigger's Cage?
No.
No, it's not. It's not. Because creatures from libraries still can't enter the battlefield, and you can still cast spells from your library. So this card is very interesting. In the imaginative post-Flash meta, I imagine this card's very powerful. Until Flash is banned, or for some reason people have decided that reanimating Protean Hulk is easier than flashing in, this card is not going to be seeing any play. It's insane with Tymna. It's very powerful. This is a very powerful Magic card. However, it doesn't do a very specific thing we need, which is stopping creatures from entering the battlefield from libraries, which is exactly what Grafdigger's Cage does, and this doesn't.
I think that's really all that's to be said. Unfortunately, as of right now, the card's not very helpful in our format, but in the future, post-Flash, we'll see. The next card we want to talk about is Underworld Breach. This card is absolutely insane. Braden, hit us up.
Underworld Breach is a red. Now, when you hear this, he said it was very good and it's red, is an enchantment. Wait, a red enchantment? This is a good red enchantment? What is going on here? What is this Magic card? Okay, Underworld Breach.
And it's not Blood Moon?
Yeah, it's not Blood Moon either, guys. It's not Blood Moon, and it's red, and it's an enchantment, and it's playable. What timeline are we in? Where are we? Where am I? So it's a red enchantment for 1 and a red. Each non-land card in your graveyard has escape. The escape cost is equal to the card's mana cost, plus you must exile 3 other cards in your graveyard. If you've been paying attention during this set, the escape cost has usually been like 6 or 4 or 5 cards.
Yeah.
Why does it say 3? That's very efficient. That's like they were trying to make this card broken.
Yup.
At the beginning of your end step, you must sacrifice Underworld Breach. So, this is like a sorcery, kind of like Yawgmoth's Will, except it's not. Your opponents can destroy it with like an Abrupt Decay or an Assassin's Trophy, but once it's on the battlefield, you'll have priority first, so you'll get to at least cast 1 spell before they can destroy it. This card is very powerful. It's also just a very good regrowth. It's also very powerful with Food Chain, because you can just exile your useless creatures that you want in exile. And finally, this is going to be a budget copy of Yawgmoth's Will. Currently, it's sitting at $3.72. Yawgmoth's Will, I don't want to look it up, but it's probably pushing $60 or $70.
It's like $70, yeah.
I think this is very powerful. I think this is going to go in a lot of red decks. It's going to push the power of red, just like Dockside Extortionist did. Cobblepot said this was going to change the format the most of any card, I think, in 2019. He said something ridiculous like that. Oracle definitely took that trophy, but this card is insane, and it's very powerful. The fact that you can chain these spells over and over again, they don't exile themselves, means that any tutor that's efficient is just going to just do nuts things. And you'll be able to replay Lotus Petals and other stuff. It's very powerful.
Yeah, that's something people who are used to seeing cards like Yawgmoth's Will or Snapcaster Mage or effects like that, we're used to seeing that when you recast the spell like a card having flashback, it would be exiled. But you could hypothetically cast a Demonic Tutor 6 or 7 times out of your graveyard in a turn, which is crazy. One personal note I know, as an Elsha player, a lot of us were worried about how to really find the most efficient way to recur spells after they had been destroyed on the battlefield, because red doesn't really recursion spells. That's a black-green thing. And the fact that Underworld Breach just came out, and now we have this amazing recursion spell in red that can really push a lot of decks to the next level. It's awesome. I mean, it is one of the best effects to come out in the color red in a very long time.
I mean, look at Godo.
Yeah.
I'm not a professional Godo player by any means, but the Godo decks currently have Goblin Welder as their way of getting back their helm if it goes to the graveyard. I don't know how many of those cards that they're going to want to run, but I mean, imagine playing this card and then just casting a ritual 3 times and then playing your Godo. That's probably going to happen eventually.
Yeah, it's really good.
So this card's nuts. We do have to remember it's only the turn you play it, but there are some cute things you can do with it.
So is Yawgmoth's Will.
Yeah. It's only just slightly better than Yawgmoth's Will sometimes. A lot of times it's worse because you can't like cast all 3 cards in your graveyard. You can't play lands. Like the value Yawg's Will is like totally real, where you go like turn 1 Mox Diamond and a land and a dork, then you go like turn 2, play the land you discarded off Mox Diamond, and then make a land drop or something. But I've definitely done that. This card has much higher combo potential, so the ceiling is much higher than Yawgmoth's Will, and the floor is lower, I think.
Right. To be honest, I can't stress enough how much a bad regrowth in red is okay.
I mean, I don't think it's okay. I think it's very powerful. I don't think it's cool that red gets regrowths now, but it's very interesting.
It's a good day to be a red player, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, sure. It's not a bad day to be a white player either. I mean, they got Heliod, so they're doing pretty good.
Yeah, I will say, I'm not in love with the stuff coming out of this set, but those colors that needed just a little bit of a shot in the arm got a little bit of something, so I'm really happy about that. The next card we're going to talk about is Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger is a legendary creature elder giant. When Kroxa enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. Now that line of text may sound familiar. We talked about Uro earlier, and it's the exact same line of text as that. So it only stays on the battlefield if you cast its escape cost, which, like Uro's blue, blue, green, green, Kroxa's is black, black, red, red, and you have to exile 5 other cards, exactly the same as Uro. But when Kroxa enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card. Then, each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. The interesting thing about Kroxa is the same thing as when we talked about Uro earlier, that if you have infinite mana, it can be cast infinitely from your command zone. So, the most famous red-black infinite mana generator is, of course, the World Gorger Dragon combo. If you are playing that combo and you generate infinite mana, you just play your commander over and over again, and your opponents will be discarding cards. So even if they are discarding non-land cards, eventually they will lose their hand, and therefore they will be losing 3 life. And since you're casting infinitely, they will lose all of their life. And it is a kill on a stick in the command zone. Also, just having a discard outlet that hits your opponents equally has been something people have played around in the past. An outdated deck has been in the form of Neheb, the original black-red Neheb from Amonkhet. So it's something people have played around with, and I'm very interested to see if it actually gets there. Right now, it's looking like it may not be the most potent deck, but it's definitely one that you may see at the table from time to time.
I think the fact that Angie allows you to play like 20 less cards by just playing 100 Madness cards and discarding them and drawing them over and over again is a bit more powerful than this.
The next card we are going to talk about is a very interesting new counterspell, Whirlwind Denial.
Whirlwind Denial is a instant for 2 and a blue. It says, for each spell and ability your opponents control, counter it unless its controller pays 4. So this does some interesting things. It's technically a stifle, so it counters abilities. It counters all spells, so it has some interesting synergies with Baral, where if you counter a spell, you draw a card and discard a card. So if you counter 10 spells, you get to draw, discard 10 times. This counters the Oracle trigger, which was going to be especially relevant in the new format. However, it is 3 mana. Probably want to be playing this in decks that are trying to hold up lots of mana and do nothing, but also don't have anything to do with that mana. So Narumeda kind of comes to mind, where it kind of just wants to hold up mana for counter spells, and then if it thinks it can win, it goes and tries to win, but otherwise it just keeps holding up mana. The Thrasios decks, you kind of want to tap out or come close to tapping out during the opponent's end step before your turn. So I don't think this card's very good in those decks. Kind of goes against the general play pattern that you're usually trying to go for. But still a good counterspell. It's something to always have in your back pocket for when the format gets very slow and stifle effects become good for some reason.
Yeah, I think this is going to be really great in decks like Baral or Rush Me, like we talked about earlier. Decks like Niv-Mizzet Parun. Those decks that are just saying, I have my Baral out on turn 2, or I have my Rush Me out, pass the turn. Ever since they get their commander out there, just passing the turn, ready to interact with the whole stack. And I think those Drago control decks are really going to enjoy this card, because yes, 3 mana is a huge investment, but if you really look at this card, it is a huge effect. I had someone that I was talking to the other day look at it, and they said, in CEDH, 4 mana is like infinite mana.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
I found that really funny.
That's true. If you've ever paid for a Mystic Remora, you had infinite mana. Come on, let's be real.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly what we were talking about. So it's definitely a really interesting card, and I think there's going to be decks that absolutely adore it, and there's going to be decks that never look at it twice. So we have 2 more cards to talk about. The first of them is going to be Destiny Spinner.
Destiny Spinner is a enchantment creature human for 1 and a green. Creature and enchantment spells you control can't be countered. You can pay 3 and a green, and target land you control becomes an XX elemental creature with trample and haste until the end of turn, where X is the number of enchantments you control. It's still a land. I have some points against this card. I saw some people talking about how they really like it. I think it has some critical problems. First, it doesn't give creatures and enchantment spells you control this ability that says it can't be countered. It just is a static effect. So if it goes away, you can just counter the spells immediately. Additionally, it dies to multiple kinds of removal, like Force of Vigor, Nature's Claim, Abrupt Decay, Rapid Hybridization. It's a card that's likely going to be hit by a Force of Vigor, to be honest, because sometimes they only have one thing they want to get rid of, and this would just be the other thing they target. Additionally, I think the option Vexing Strisher is quite a bit better. It makes stuff uncounterable in response to the counter spells, which has a mana cost. However, the threat of using Vexing Strisher is usually enough to make the spell uncounterable. Additionally, you can use Vexing Strisher to make your opponent's stuff uncounterable, which also has the effect of passively making things uncounterable, so you usually don't have to spend as much mana on it as you would think you do. Suddenly, Vexing Strisher is making a large amount of card advantage for you, because your opponents have to throw multiple answers at certain spells that you're casting. So the up for this is that it makes your lands into creatures, but I think that ability is mostly useless. Maybe I'm misevaluating it. I know Ian feels very differently.
Yeah, I have to disagree about the fact that it has no other upside against Vexing Strisher. First of all, the main upside, I think, of it is that it is a static on the card. Therefore, you have to invest 0 mana into this effect for it to give protection to the creatures that you are casting. The second thing I have to say is, I know that there are a number of decks, at least in the past or currently, that were running Gaia's Herald, which is just 2 mana 1/1 for 1 and a green that just says creature spells can't be countered. So comparatively to that card, it is a nearly strict upgrade. It can be hit by obviously the Nature's Claim and the Force of Vigor effects, but apart from that, it is a relevant body. A 2/3 is not going to get beat up on nearly as much as a 1/1 will. And the target land you control ability is fine. It's not why I want to play that card. So I think especially in decks like Animar that can play this for a single green, I think Destiny Spinner is actually a pretty good card for that deck. And as I said, it has 0 investment that you have to continually put into the card. The 2/3 body is pretty relevant. The static ability is pretty relevant. And I think that the card has a lot of upside in green decks that really want it. As Braden talked about, Vexing Strisher may be better in certain decks, but I think there are decks that will want to play this over that effect.
I also just wanted to mention there are other cards that make it so your creature spells can't be countered. Prowling Serpapard is another card that makes it so your creature spells can't be countered, but it also can't be countered, which is a bit of a bump. It's also a 4/3, which is just massive. Every time I see it, I'm just like, wow, that's a rate. It's also a cat snake, which is pretty cute. So check that out if you're also looking for an effect like that.
Yeah, if you're looking to invest a little more mana into a card, then Serp Apart is definitely a great way to
Yeah.
put it.
It's also good with Selvala because it's a 4/3 instead of a 2/3. So it actually draws a card off Selvala if it's the first creature you play after playing your Selvala.
All right, the last card we wanted to talk about is a legendary creature that actually both Braden and I simultaneously had come to talk to each other, finding this card very interesting. It is Siona, Captain of the Peleus.
Siona is a legendary creature, human soldier. It's an uncommon. That's kind of relevant, I think. It is a 3-drop for 1 green and a white. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal an aura card from among them and put them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Whenever an aura you control becomes attached to a creature you control, create a 1/1 white human creature token.
So this card is actually competitively relevant because it combos with a card called Shielded by Faith. Shielded by Faith is an aura that grants a creature indestructible, and it also says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you may equip Shielded by Faith to that creature. So when you target Siona with Shielded by Faith, Siona's ability triggers. The one that says whenever an aura you control becomes attached to a creature, create a 1/1 human soldier token. So the 1/1 will come in, the aura will attach to it, and Siona's ability will once again trigger, creating another 1/1. That 1/1 will enter, trigger Shielded by Faith, and Shielded by Faith will have the option to go attach to that creature. And that chain will continue. So you basically, with just these 2 cards, make infinite 1/1 creatures. Now you're going to need another outlet, like something like Blasting Station to do infinite damage, or you have to find a way for your opponents not to wipe the board in that one turn.
I honestly think most of the time, you really won't. People are not running as many board wipes as they used to. Sure, some people are on the Pyroclasm effects. I get that. But I think sometimes if you just pop this off early enough, or you've stacked the table out enough with like cards like Trinisphere, Sphere of Resistance, I think you might just be able to get it. Like, okay guys, I made infinite creatures, pass.
Yeah, I agree.
It's pretty good. Additionally, one thing I wanted to point out is that she looks at the top 7 cards of your library for the combo piece. That's insane. It's a 1-card combo. It's very interesting. There's really nothing like this. Maybe, I guess Godo. Godo is the closest thing like this, where it's a 0-card combo. Sure, you might not hit it, but maybe you want to run flicker effects, or you want to run some type of way of getting multiples of that ETB effect just to get there. Additionally, white has tons of ways to tutor for Shielded by Faith. It also layers very well with Heliod the Sun-Crowned and the Walking Ballista combo. It also layers very well with Pattern Rector. I'm actually kind of confident that this list is going to be something people who just want to get into the format on a budget or want to try out something super weird 1 week at an event will be able to try out. It's very interesting.
I like the Godo comparison because compared to Godo costs 11 mana to let that combo go off, whereas this costs only 3. And I know Godo wins that turn, but still, that gives you room to give another outlet to the deck. I think it's also very interesting that it's in green, so you can use things like having a turn 1 mana dork immediately curves right into this. So I think it's got a lot of upside. In addition, you can play some stacks effects like Null Rod or Collector Oof, and that's a really good place to be in the format. So that concludes our set review for Theros Beyond Death. We've got a couple more things we want to touch on before we close the cast. Braden, you said you have an important event that you're running that you want to talk about?
So I am the chief tournament organizer, I just found out, of this event we're running in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. So in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, on February 1st, we're going to be running an event. It's going to be like a CEDH and casual EDH event. We're currently close to having 40-something people signed up. So basically, it's a CEDH tournament. It's a $20 buy-in. We're flying out Shaper Savant. There's tons of prizes. You can find out more about it at the website ddmgaming.com. I'm very, very excited. It's going to be a lot of fun. Scotty from Sky Knows Gaming is coming down, so we're going to have Scotty and Shaper. Ian might come down. We're not sure yet.
Yeah, I'm doing my best.
Yeah, tons of people. We're having people coming down all the way from South Carolina and all the way up from Massachusetts / upstate New York. So it's gonna be a blast.
Yeah, this is one of the bigger organized CEDH tournaments we've really had, so it's going to be very exciting.
This is the first one managed by people who are actually members of the online community.
Well, thank you everyone for once again joining us here at the CEDH cast. Before we go, Braden, do you want to hit us with those social media whereabouts?
Sure. You can find us on Discord, which is probably in the description, or on our Twitter. You can find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/CEDHcast. You can find us on SoundCloud. It's soundcloud.com/CEDH-cast. You can find us on YouTube under CEDHcast. You can find us on Instagram at CEDHcast. Yeah, that's about it. It's a lot of places. But if you just look up or Google CEDHcast, you'll probably find us.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know we've been talking with the community about different places where we can put the RSS feed for the cast, and I know we're on Spotify, we are on SoundCloud, we are on Google Play Podcast, and we're working to get more and more places. So if you have any suggestions on places you'd like to listen to the cast, just throw them out there. And we just actually added YouTube between the last 2 episodes, so great. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us once again here at the cedhcast. From all of us, thank you for joining us, and we're excited to see you next time. Bye.
Bye.